August 7th, 1942. The first American offensive of World War II began with a lie. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal were told they'd face light opposition, maybe a few thousand Japanese construction workers building an airfield. They'd secure the island quickly, then move on to the next objective. That's what the intelligence said. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. What the Marines found wasn't a quick operation. It was 6 months of absolute hell-savage night battles, when nobody could see who they were shooting, diseases that killed as efficiently as bullets, starvation that reduced both armies to skeletons, and a campaign so brutal that both sides called it the Starvation Island. Guadalcanal wasn't a battle. It was an attrition grinder that broke units, destroyed ships, and killed thousands of men through combat, disease, and hunger. This is the story of how America learned to fight in the Pacific, one horrific night at a time, on an island where survival itself was victory. The invasion began with confusion. The 1st Marine Division hit the beaches expecting resistance. They got none. The Japanese construction workers fled into the jungle. The Marines secured the partially completed airfield, later named Henderson Field, within hours. This was supposed to be difficult, and it was almost comically easy. The officers were suspicious. Where were the Japanese? Why wasn't anyone shooting? The answer was simple. The Japanese garrison was small, mostly engineers and labor troops. The Marines outnumbered them heavily, but that wouldn't last. Japanese headquarters saw the invasion and immediately recognized the threat. Guadalcanal sat across the supply lines to Australia. The airfield threatened Japanese naval operations. This couldn't be allowed. Reinforcements were already being loaded onto ships. The Marines dug in around Henderson Field. They had no idea what was coming. The Navy had dropped them off with minimal supplies. There hadn't been enough transport shipping to bring everything needed. Food was tight. Ammunition was adequate, but not abundant. The Marines had seized thousands of bags of rice from Japanese stores, so at least they could eat. The perimeter was established. Patrols went out. The jungle was oppressive, dense, hot, humid, filled with insects. The Marines adapted quickly because they had to. This was their beachhead. Lose it, and the entire operation collapsed. The first naval battle happened on August 9th, just 2 days after the landing. The Battle of Savo Island. Japanese cruisers came down from Rabaul at night. They caught the American screening force completely by surprise. The resulting action was a disaster for the US Navy. 4 heavy cruisers sunk. Over 1,000 sailors dead. The Japanese ships withdrew before dawn, having accomplished their mission of disrupting the invasion fleet. The American transports and escorts pulled out, fearing another attack. The Marines on Guadalcanal watched their ships leave. They were alone, cut off. Whatever happened next, they'd face it without naval support, without air cover, with limited supplies. The abandonment wasn't intentional. The Navy had legitimate concerns about another Japanese attack, but the effect was the same. The Marines were stranded. Henderson Field became operational in mid-August. The Marines finished the airfield the Japanese had started. Aircraft flew in fighters and dive bombers. Suddenly, the equation changed. During the day, American aircraft controlled the skies around Guadalcanal. Japanese ships couldn't approach without being attacked. But at night, American aircraft couldn't operate effectively. Darkness belonged to the Japanese Navy. This created a pattern that would last for months. Americans controlled the island during the day. Japanese controlled the waters around it at night. Supplies came in under cover of darkness. So did reinforcements. So did warships to bombard Henderson Field. The Tokyo Express, the Americans called it the Rat Run, was the Japanese supply line. Fast destroyers loaded with troops and supplies would race down from Rabaul at dusk, arrive at Guadalcanal after dark, unload, and race back before dawn. The trips were dangerous but effective. Japanese destroyers could make the round trip in one night, staying beyond the range of Henderson Field's aircraft. Every night, more Japanese troops arrived. Every night, the Marines' numerical advantage eroded. The Japanese were building up forces for a counterattack while simultaneously preventing the Americans from being reinforced effectively. The land battles started in August and never really stopped. Japanese doctrine emphasized offense. They didn't believe in static defense. They attacked. The first major assault came on August 21st, the Battle of the Tenaru River. Though it wasn't actually at the Tenaru, around 900 Japanese troops charged the Marine positions at night. Banzai charges, screaming, chaos in the darkness. The Marines held. By morning, nearly all the attacking Japanese troops were dead. Bodies piled up in front of the defensive positions. The Marines had won, but the ferocity of the attack was shocking. The Japanese would charge into machine gun fire. They'd keep coming even when it was obvious the attack had failed. This wasn't rational military tactics. This was something different. The jungle itself was an enemy. Malaria was endemic. Nearly every man on the island contracted it at some point. The symptoms were debilitating fever chills, weakness. Men would shake uncontrollably during fever spikes. Quinine helped, but wasn't always available in sufficient quantities. Dysentery ravaged both sides. Fungal infections developed in the constant humidity. Jungle rot ate at skin. Minor cuts became infected and refused to heal. The heat was brutal temperatures in the 90s with humidity near 100%. Men lost weight rapidly. Uniforms rotted. Equipment corroded. The island was actively hostile to human habitation. Food became the obsession. The Marines were on short rations almost immediately. 2 meals a day, both inadequate. Rice supplemented with whatever could be scavenged. Sea rations when available. The men were always hungry. Weight loss was universal. Veterans of Guadalcanal lost 26 kilos, 20-30, sometimes 40 pounds during the campaign. They looked skeletal by the end. The Japanese had it worse. Their supply lines were longer and more vulnerable. American aircraft and submarines interdicted the Tokyo Express. Many nights the destroyers couldn't make it through. Japanese troops on the island started starving. By October and November, starvation was killing as many Japanese as combat. Men too weak to fight, too weak to walk, dying in the jungle from malnutrition and disease. The naval battles continued throughout the campaign. Iron Bottom Sound, the channel between Guadalcanal and the neighbouring islands, became a graveyard. So many ships sunk that the name became literal. Every few weeks, another major naval engagement. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November. 2 days of savage fighting that saw 2 American admirals killed and multiple capital ships sunk on both sides. The Japanese battleship Kirishima bombarded Henderson Field, then was destroyed by USS Washington. Cruisers and destroyers fought gun battles at point-blank range. Ships collided in the darkness. The naval campaign was as brutal as the land campaign, with both sides bleeding ships and sailors. The night battles on land had their own particular horror. The Japanese attacked at night almost exclusively. They believed darkness gave them advantage. Sometimes it did. American troops would hear movement in the jungle, shouting in Japanese. Then the attack would come. You couldn't see what you were shooting at. Muzzle flashes in the dark. Grenade explosions. Close combat with bayonets and rifle butts. Artillery firing blind. The chaos was complete. Friend and fire incidents were common. You'd hear someone moving and shoot, then find out it was another Marine. Or you'd hold fire thinking it was friendly and get overrun. Night fighting was psychological warfare as much as physical combat. The fear was constant. Henderson Field was the key to everything. If the Japanese captured it, they'd have air superiority. They could bring in supplies during the day. They could isolate the American forces completely. So the Japanese kept attacking it. Infantry assaults, naval bombardments, artillery when they got guns ashore. The Marines and later Army units defended it with desperate determination. The airfield was cratered repeatedly. The engineers would fill in the craters overnight. Aircraft would take off in the morning. The runway was never perfect, but it was always operational. That made the difference. As long as American aircraft could fly from Henderson, the Japanese couldn't win. But keeping it operational required holding a perimeter, and holding the perimeter required surviving constant attacks. September and October were the worst months. The Japanese built up a major force over 20,000 troops. They planned a coordinated offensive to retake the island. The Americans knew something was coming, but not exactly when or where. The tension was unbearable. Patrols clashed in the jungle, artillery duels, night raids. The main Japanese attack came in mid-October. Multiple prongs, heavy artillery preparation, infantry assaults against several sections of the perimeter simultaneously. The fighting lasted for days. The Marines held by the thinnest margins. There were moments when breakthrough seemed imminent. Positions were overrun and then retaken. Men fought hand to hand. The defensive line bent, but didn't break. The human cost was staggering. Americans suffered thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, missing. The Japanese casualties were far worse. Their doctrine of relentless attack, regardless of cost, meant they died in huge numbers. Bodies littered the battlefield. Burial details couldn't keep up. The dead decomposed in the tropical heat. The smell was indescribable. Disease spread from the corpses. The area around the defensive perimeter became a charnel house. Veterans would remember the smell for the rest of their lives. Rotting flesh, cordite, jungle rot, dysentery, all mixed together in the humid air. The psychological toll matched the physical. Men cracked under the strain. Combat fatigue was universal. Some men broke completely catatonic, unable to function, evacuated if possible. Others held together through the campaign, but were permanently damaged. The constant stress attacks at night, disease, hunger, exhaustion was too much for human nervous systems designed for brief periods of high stress, not months of sustained horror. Veterans developed what we'd now call PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, inability to adjust to normal life. The Guadalcanal veterans were marked by what they'd endured. November brought the decisive moment. The naval battle of Guadalcanal was actually two separate engagements on November 12th the 13th and November 14th the 15th. The Japanese were attempting to land massive reinforcements and supplies. American naval forces intercepted them. The fighting was savage. Close-range gun battles, torpedoes, destroyers, engaging battleships, chaos and carnage. When it was over, both sides had lost heavily, but the Japanese had lost more. Critically, they'd failed to land the reinforcements. The troops and supplies they'd hoped to deliver went down with the transports. The Japanese position on Guadalcanal became untenable. They were cut off, starving, outnumbered. Victory was no longer possible. December and January were mopping up. The Japanese evacuated at night using the same Tokyo Express that had brought reinforcements in. They got most of their surviving troops off the island. The Americans didn't realize immediately that the Japanese were withdrawing. It looked like repositioning until patrols found abandoned positions. By February 1943, organized resistance ceased. Guadalcanal was secure. The campaign was over. The cost was horrific. Americans over 7,000 casualties, including 1,600 dead on land plus the naval losses. Japanese over 30,000 casualties, including over 20,000 dead, many from starvation and disease. Dozens of ships sunk on both sides. The water around Guadalcanal was filled with wrecks. The strategic significance was enormous. Guadalcanal was the first major American offensive victory. It proved that Japanese expansion could be stopped and reversed. It gave the Allies a base for further operations up the Solomon Islands chain. It bled the Japanese Navy ships and experienced crews lost that couldn't be replaced. The veteran pilots lost at Guadalcanal were irreplaceable. Japan's industrial capacity couldn't match American production. Every carrier aircraft lost, every experienced pilot killed, every ship sunk tilted the balance further toward America. Guadalcanal started that process. But the significance goes beyond strategy. Guadalcanal taught the American military how to fight in the Pacific. The tactics, the equipment, the logistics, all of it was learned on Guadalcanal through trial and error, blood and death. Night fighting techniques, jungle warfare, amphibious operations, naval night combat, coordination between air, land and sea forces. The lessons were expensive, but essential. Later campaigns benefited from what was learned at Guadalcanal. The mistakes made there weren't repeated. The tactics that worked were refined. Guadalcanal was the laboratory where American Pacific doctrine was developed. The men who fought there were never the same. The physical damage was obvious: weight loss, malaria injuries. The psychological damage was less visible but equally real. They'd survived something that shouldn't be survivable. 6 months of continuous combat operations, constant danger, disease, starvation, the loss of friends, the things they'd seen and done. No training could prepare someone for Guadalcanal. You learned by surviving, or you didn't survive. The veterans carried that knowledge, that trauma, for the rest of their lives. Starvation Island wasn't propaganda. Both sides were literally starving. Japanese troops ate grassroots, anything they could find. American troops were perpetually hungry, surviving on inadequate rations. Weight loss was universal. Men became walking skeletons. Energy levels plummeted. Simple tasks became exhausting. Starvation affects everything: physical strength, mental acuity, emotional stability, immune function. Men who were starving were also fighting malaria, dysentery, and combat stress. The human body can only take so much. At Guadalcanal, both sides pushed beyond that limit and kept going because stopping meant death. The environmental conditions were part of the weapon system. The Japanese understood jungle warfare better. Initially, they'd fought in China, Malaya, Burma, but even they weren't prepared for Guadalcanal's particular hell. The island was large enough that controlling one piece didn't mean controlling all of it. The jungle was so dense that visibility was measured in yards. Navigation was nearly impossible. Patrols got lost regularly. The rain was constant during the wet season, torrential downpours that turned everything into mud. Streams became raging torrents. The airfield turned into a swamp. Operations slowed to a crawl during heavy rain. Then the sun would come out, the temperature would spike, and everything would steam. The air crews at Henderson Field lived their own version of hell. They flew missions daily, sometimes multiple times a day. The aircraft were constantly being repaired, battle damage where corrosion from the salt air. Parts were scarce. Mechanics performed miracles keeping the planes airborne. Pilots flew with malaria, with dysentery, with exhaustion so severe they'd fall asleep immediately after landing. They lived in tents near the runway. When Japanese ships bombarded the field at night, the pilots would take cover in foxholes, then get up in the morning and fly. The casualty rate was high. Aircraft were lost to combat accidents, mechanical failure. Replacement pilots arrived and died within days. The veterans, the ones who survived more than a few weeks, became aces through sheer attrition. The naval crews had their own trauma. The night battles were terrifying. Modern warships with radar and fire control were shooting at each other at ranges where you could see the enemy with the naked eye. Shells hitting at point-blank range, torpedoes crossing paths, ships exploding, burning, sinking. The water was infested with sharks. Sailors who went into the water had to worry about drowning, burning oil sharks and being run over by other ships. Rescue was uncertain. Many men were never found. The ships that survived would return to port patch, their damage take on ammunition and fuel and go right back. The operational tempo was unsustainable, but it had to be sustained because the alternative was losing Guadalcanal. The logistics were a nightmare. Everything had to come by ship: food, ammunition, medical supplies, fuel, replacement troops. The supply line stretched back to Australia and the United States. Japanese submarines hunted the supply convoys. Aircraft attacked when they could. Getting supplies to Guadalcanal was dangerous. Getting them distributed on the island was difficult. The roads were poor. The jungle was impassable to vehicles in many areas. Everything was carried by truck when possible, by hand when necessary. Supply dumps were targeted by Japanese artillery. Henderson Field was constantly under threat. The logistics officers performed miracles keeping the troops supplied at all, even if those supplies were never adequate. The medical situation was grim. Field hospitals operated under impossible conditions, limited supplies, overwhelmed by casualties, disease as well as wounds. The doctors and nurses worked constantly. Triage was brutal: who gets treated first, who gets evacuated, who gets left to die because there aren't enough resources. Malaria patients filled the hospitals. So did dysentery cases, and combat casualties, gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, burns. The medical staff suffered from the same diseases and starvation as everyone else. They just had to keep working. Medical evacuations were difficult. The seriously wounded were flown out when possible. Others waited for ships. Some died waiting. The turning point wasn't a single moment. It was cumulative. The Japanese lost the naval battle of Guadalcanal. They couldn't land reinforcements effectively after that. Their troops on the island were cut off, starving, dying. The mathematics of attrition shifted decisively. By December, everyone knew the outcome. The Japanese would hold on as long as possible, then evacuate. The Americans would keep pressing. The only question was, how many more people would die before the end? The answer was thousands more. The Japanese didn't surrender easily. American troops had to clear the island position by position, taking casualties, even when the strategic outcome was decided. The evacuation was the final Japanese success. In January and February, they pulled off a well-executed withdrawal. Destroyers came at night. Troops were evacuated in good order. The Americans didn't seriously contest it. The goal was securing the island, not killing every last Japanese soldier. The Japanese got about 10,000 troops off. Another 20,000 were already dead, killed in combat, or dead from disease and starvation. The troops who evacuated were in terrible condition, malnourished, diseased, exhausted. But they were alive. The Japanese Navy executed the evacuation professionally. It was one of the few things that went right for them during the entire campaign. February 1943. Guadalcanal secure. The campaign officially over. The island would serve as a base for future operations. Henderson Field, the objective that had cost so much to capture and hold, would support aircraft attacking up the Solomon Islands chain. The nightmare was over for the men who survived. They were evacuated, sent to rear areas, given time to recover. Many never fully recovered. The weight loss could be regained. The malaria could be treated. The physical wounds would heal. But the psychological scars were permanent. 6 months. August 1942 to February 1943. That's how long Guadalcanal lasted. It's remembered as one of the most brutal campaigns of World War II. The veterans who fought there are mostly gone now. The jungle has reclaimed much of what was fought over. The wrecks still lie in Iron Bottom Sound. Guadalcanal is peaceful now, but for 6 months, in 1942 to 43, it was hell. Unrelenting chaos, combat every night, disease every day, starvation as a constant companion, both sides calling it the Starvation Island because that's what it was. A place where survival itself was victory, where every day alive was an achievement, where the normal human limits of endurance were exceeded and then exceeded again. The Marines who landed on August 7th expecting quick victory found instead 6 months of fighting that broke bodies and minds, but ultimately secured the island. That's Guadalcanal, not a battle, a campaign. 6 months of hell that nobody who was there ever forgot.